Just a brief note before we get started. This episode will discuss and describe sexual assault and may be inappropriate for some listeners. Go ahead and do a test.
Test. 1, 2, 5, 6. You know I don't know how to count. That's why I work in accounting.
This is Felicia Bruce, a member of my congregation. Felicia has a witty personality and a giving heart. She is also tenaciously loyal. If you have gained her trust, she will go to the ends of the earth and back for you. As I often say, everyone needs a friend like Felicia.
I was born in Chicago, Southside, in Argyle Gardens. The fifth child of my mother's, the umpteenth child of my father's. I mean, I didn't have a hard childhood, didn't get in trouble. I pretty much was number 2 in my class for the most athletic, because there was always going to be that one boy that kind of ranked supreme over you. So I was the number 1 girl. 8th grade, my gym teacher came to me. He was like, I need you to, dribble the ball around, shoot a couple of shots, because I have somebody who's going to watch you. I didn't realize it was a scout. I pretty much was drafted to play basketball at Washington High School. And I was the only one that was chosen out of my whole school to play. I played the at-home games. I didn't play many away games until maybe like the final couple. But during that time, when I got out of school, my father had moved on from the grocery store. He had opened up a video store in the Inglewood area. At this point, my mother contacted my father and started having me to go to his store, and then he would bring me home after he closed. At that time, my father, who I call a gigolo, he was married, but he was separated. His wife lived in Milwaukee. But because she was sick, she came back into the picture, basically. She eventually passed on. My father, he was hurt. I know that. And while he was hurt, it was after her funeral and everything, me being who I am, tried to console him. It's going to be okay. So when the touching started, I remember we were at the store. It was closed. He was watching a movie, and he was crying. I was consoling him. We were sitting there talking, and all of a sudden he started smoking some weed. He asked me, did I want it? I was like, no. He just kept asking me, and of course I took some, but then after I took it, I'm about 13 years old, I started feeling kind of wheezy and queasy, and my head was hurting. I wanted to lay down. So I laid down, and shortly thereafter, I'm starting to feel his hands rubbing up against my back, rubbing up and down, my body. And at that point, kind of like faded out. So I don't remember much of anything after that. And that was the start of him touching me. And when I attempted to tell my mom about it, I knew how much she loved him and how much it would hurt her. I took her feelings and put them ahead of mine. And I remember once I told my friend I didn't want to go to his store, and I stayed with her. But I was afraid to go home. When I did finally go home, I saw my mom. She beat me because she thought I was out there in the streets being bad. But I wasn't. Because when I tried to tell her, she didn't believe me then. And after that, that's when the assaults got just out of control. And I kind of distanced myself from everybody. All of a sudden, everybody else started noticing a change in me. But my cousin was living with us. Her comment to my mother was, "You worried about me, you need to pay attention to your daughter." She made that comment, my mother. When I came home, she asked me some questions, I answered them. And we went to the doctor and confirmed that I was pregnant.
My name is Alex Lang, and you are listening to Restorative Faith, my podcast for those who question and doubt. The goal of this series is to recast Christianity in a new light. This season is about sexuality and its role in driving people away from the church. In our first episode of this season, we discussed the roots of the traditional Christian perspective on sex and how those roots created what has become known as purity culture, or the purity movement. Purity culture promotes the idea that Christians should not think about or engage in any type of sexual activity until they are married. Unfortunately, this theology has many negative repercussions, not the least of which is that Christians view sex as an act that has been sanctified by God. Rather than claim that sexual thoughts, feelings, and desires are inherently wrong, the church needs to acknowledge that engaging in sexual behavior is a natural progression of human relationships. When sex is no longer an act sanctified by God, it opens the door to new ways of talking about sex and sexuality. But the truth is, this is easier said than done. We still have to navigate past many landmines that are preventing us from walking through that door. Perhaps one of the biggest landmines is the function of sex in our lives. Sex is something that humans engage in for pleasure. But the end result of the sexual act, at least between a man and a woman, is the potential for new life. Sex propagates the species. The connection between sex and life is something that can never be decoupled. And for many Christians, this connection is why sex is viewed as an act that has been sanctified by God. According to Genesis chapter 1, verse 26, humans are created in the image and likeness of God. Since the Bible tells us that humans are the only creatures endowed with this characteristic, many Christians assume that this means that all human life is sanctified by God. So the argument goes something like this. Since all human life is sacred, if a sexual encounter produces a pregnancy, then that human life must be protected at all costs. Our goal in this episode is to examine this argument. We're going to take a deep dive into the moral connection between sex and life. Where does the Christian perspective on this connection make sense? Where does it fall short? And what does it tell us about how the church should approach sexuality in the 21st century? To begin, I want to return to Felicia's story and what happened after she found out that she was pregnant.
We got home. At this point, my mother, she asked me what had been going on, who I've been with, and I told her again. I finally told her everything. All I can remember is him telling me to, take off my clothes and him getting on top of me. Or sometimes he'll just make me get on top of him. I do remember fighting him once, and that only made matters worse because that was even more painful than the act itself. But mostly everything else is very cloudy, it's foggy. I remember locations. I remember crying after the fact, crying during the fact, crying before because I didn't want to do it, and me pleading and telling him, no, I don't want to. This is not right. I'm your child. And it seemed like everything I said was, he didn't hear it. He didn't see it. It's like I saw fire in his eyes. Me being a little small, petite, probably under 100 pounds at the time, wasn't much I can do anyway. Yeah, truly is beyond that. I don't remember much of anything. At this point, my mother called my father and told him to come over. He got there. He had a van. We jumped in his van. It was him, me, and my mother. I didn't know she brought her gun with her. And had I not been there, she would have shot him. So she told him that he had to the end of that night to turn himself in. So he took us back. He was staying on the west side with my younger brother's mom. He played with them a little while. He went and closed up his store, and he did turn himself in.
What happened to Felicia, where she described being foggy about the details of the numerous incidents of sexual assault that she endured at the hands of her father, is a common occurrence among people who experience sexual trauma. In the world of psychology, this phenomena is commonly referred to as repression. The concept of repression is an important thread that we will be following throughout this season, so it's necessary for us to get a handle on why repression happens and how it impacts our relationships. To gain a deeper understanding of repression, I interviewed Dr. Melissa Perrin, a licensed clinical psychologist who has a private practice in Evanston, Illinois, and who also serves as a psychological consultant to the Episcopal Diocese of Chicago. Dr. Perrin is well known in her field as she has worked extensively with both victims and perpetrators of sexual abuse for over 35 years.
Yes, repression is a defense mechanism. It is one of the most important ways that we manage anxiety. In my work, repression takes place in the memory so that we forget events, we forget incidents, we actively, consciously push them to the side and say, I can't deal with that right now, or I've been told that I shouldn't bring that up right now, or the situation will become worse if I talk about this or act on this right now. So it's better for me and everybody involved to keep it under wraps. What causes us to repress individually is there's material that we cannot wrap our minds around or we cannot take action on. And the reason we cannot take action on it is either it's completely out of our ability to do anything about it, and or we can take action, but the consequence of taking action is too strong for us or too extreme for us, whether that's on a one-to-one basis, and then there's the ripple effect of how many people are affected by my statement of truth or your statement of truth, or if it's just that the one person that I'm with will simply leave my life, but it'll be messy. We also use repression when we're fearful, when we don't know what a potential outcome is, and we catastrophize the potential outcome, and we say, I can't risk any of those outcomes, and so I must repress it. Or it's the information is so big, so distressing, and we can't integrate it into our psyche or our timeline, our personal understanding of our history, that it just simply gets locked into another room.
So in the case of Felicia, her choice to remain quiet about the abuse was due to her fear of destroying the relationship with her family. As you heard Felicia say earlier, she knew how much her mother loved her father and how divulging the abuse would hurt her mother. Furthermore, she feared the ripple effect of how that information would change the nature of her relationship with her family. Once the secret was out, how would her mother react? Would her mother blame her? Would she understand? What would happen to her father? And most importantly, how would Felicia be viewed by her family from that point forward? How would she carry the shame associated with this type of relationship? As Dr. Perrin said, this secret was so big and so distressing that Felicia didn't know how to integrate it into her psyche, so she repressed it and locked it away. And yet, Felicia was not the only one going through repression. Felicia's mother was tuning out many of the signs that something was amiss with the relationship between Felicia and her father. Had it not been for Felicia's cousin, who could see that something was clearly wrong, the secret might well have remained hidden. Dr. Perrin described to me how it is very common for repression to extend beyond the people who are directly involved in the illicit act.
Well, I'll tell you what's coming up for me are stories about people I've worked with whose family members are sex addicts. In my career, and I would say that I've heard this from about 15 different women saying that their husband and their sister were sexual, and that they knew that it was happening and they were in the same room when it was happening, or they were aware that it was happening and actively chose to walk past the room or the coat closet or the garage or the car or wherever the sexual event was taking place, and actively chose not to go in and confront, and then hazed it out. We talk a lot about the haziness of memory. That's 100% of the time when asked, why do you think you walked past them, or why do you think you erased that email, or why do you think you forgot? Putting that in air quotes, that material, the answer always is, if I confronted them, I'd have to do something about it. And I wasn't ready for my life to explode.
And here we can see how repression is directly connected to the fear of social judgment. The women walking past their husbands engaged in illicit sexual acts not only have to be prepared for the personal devastation of exposing a humiliating sexual secret, but they also have to carry the shame that comes with the public learning of those acts. As Dr. Perrin said, their life would explode. And the reason why their life would explode is because we, as a society, have agreed that certain ways of behaving are appropriate, while other behaviors are off limits. For instance, a father is not supposed to sleep with his daughter. Why have we agreed that this behavior is off limits? Well, if you're a Christian, You can find a rule prohibiting incestuous relationships in Leviticus 18:17, which prohibits a man from engaging in sexual activity with both a woman and her daughter. But that still doesn't answer why incest goes against the social contract. What the biblical authors knew back then, and what we know today, is that when a pregnancy results from an incestuous relationship, there's a much higher likelihood that the baby will suffer from severe birth defects. In other words, incestuous relationships are restricted because of how it impacts the potential for new life. Incest results in high negative outcomes for children. So we as a society have agreed that it's important for immediate family members to repress those sexual urges towards one another. This is an instance where repression is a good thing. When that code is broken, the negative social consequences can be quite severe for the people involved. Let's return to Felicia's story and hear how she dealt with those consequences.
My father was arrested. A few days later, DCFS came to my house, and he was talking to me and my mom. By that time, I was already too far gone to have an abortion, but they threw up the possibility of putting the baby up for adoption. I told them no, because if I'm carrying this child, my thoughts would have been towards, is he being raised? Is he okay? How is he? Is he being abused? Is he being loved? All of those thoughts would have been going through my head, and I couldn't do it. So I chose to keep the child. From there, the caseworker, she got me connected with the alternative high school so I wouldn't miss any education. Pregnant or not, I still wanted my education. Even after I had Ryan, I thought about killing both of us off. I thought about visiting my father and taking a chef's knife and just driving it through his chest. But then I would have to take me and Ryan's life at the same time, because I didn't want anybody else raising them.
With the help of a psychiatrist, Felicia was able to work past the maelstrom of anger and shame that led her to contemplate murder-suicide. But there are many victims of incest who do not have access to the same care and support. Incest is one of the most complex traumas a person can endure, with some of the most severe psychological consequences. This is why Felicia represents one of those rare instances that often comes up in discussions around abortion. If a woman is the victim of incest, is it morally wrong to terminate the pregnancy? There are two issues at the core of this discussion: how the pregnancy came about and the preservation of life. I want to begin with the preservation of life and come back to the issue of how the pregnancy came about. One of the reasons why abortion is such a volatile subject for Christians is their belief that every human life is of infinite value. Since all humans are made in the image and likeness of God, the conclusion is that human life should be preserved at all costs. But there's more to this argument than meets the eye. To explore this issue, we interviewed Dr. Dixon Sutherland, professor of religious studies at Stetson University. You may remember Dr. Sutherland from Season 1, where we discussed the evangelical response to climate change. Since evangelicals are at the forefront of the abortion debate, we asked Dr. Sutherland to walk us through the biblical ethics surrounding the issue of abortion.
Now, if you go to the Old Testament, the Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible, which most Christians don't read and don't accept as scripture, even though it's supposed to be, abortion, whether it's actually mentioned, is questionable, but if it is, it's listed with a lot of other things, like peeing inside the camp is an abomination. You have to pee outside the camp. So we're not talking about capital punishment level kind of things here. And we're also talking about where a man spills his sperm, which is an abomination because you've killed life, which links us to abortion, by the way, because if you want to take abortion to its biblical limits, life is in the sperm, and if a man masturbates, the sperm life is killed, and therefore an abomination against the Lord. So let's forget about women. Women are always the victims here. Let's talk about men. I think we can find statistics on men masturbating. Well, they're killing life. according to the Bible. So we need to be careful about taking the Bible literally and extending that out to women who have been victimized for centuries.
Dr. Sutherland's last point is very critical in understanding this issue. For the authors of the Old Testament, a man spilling his semen is as much an abortion as a woman losing her pregnancy. Today, many people would argue that those two things are not equivalent, but we have to remember that the point of sex in the Bible is to procreate. The reason for this can be attributed to the high mortality rates in the ancient world. You needed to have sex as much as possible because viable pregnancies were hard to come by. Today, in industrialized nations, women miscarry at a rate of around 15 to 20%. In the ancient world, because of malnutrition, disease, and other environmental factors, miscarriages could be as high as 50%.
The word for miscarriage in German is Abortionen. A miscarriage is an abortion in most linguistic contexts. It's a natural act. A woman cannot help it. It's a medical act that happens naturally. Statistically, there are more miscarriages than there are live births. Women miscarry all the time, sometimes don't even know it. These are not moral events.
Beyond miscarriages, we also have to recognize that even when you had a viable pregnancy in the ancient world, there was no guarantee that your child would live into adulthood. If your newborn made it out of childbirth alive, there was a 28% chance of your infant dying from disease prior to reaching 1 year of life. But those who were able to pass the 1 year mark were still not completely out of the woods. In total, 40% of all children born in the ancient world would die before puberty. Because the death rates among children were so high, it was not uncommon for ancient people to develop a much more detached attitude towards children than we possess today. Indeed, many ancient cultures saw children as being disposable, but early Christians took a different approach.
Let's go to the New Testament, which Christians say, yeah, but that's the Old Testament. Well, let's go to the New Testament. Is it mentioned? Yeah, it's mentioned. But is it mentioned as an ultimate crime? No. It's mentioned as a part of other issues. It's mentioned in the context of a pagan Greco-Roman society in which infanticide is lawful. You can take a baby, have it born, throw it on a trash heap, and nobody's going to criminalize you in the Roman world of that day. Christians were very reactive against that. They would take these babies born on a trash heap, they would rescue them, they would raise them as Christians. So it's natural to understand their understanding of abortion, but let's remember, they didn't know what the formation of a womb consisted of. They didn't know how the scientific development of a fetus was. So we can't take biblical orientations to abortion and transfer them directly to a modern world setting. That's inappropriate.
Here, Dr. Sutherland has identified a major disconnect between the original Christian thinking surrounding abortion and the issue as it exists today. I think we can all agree that adopting a child abandoned by their parents is a good thing. But we have to keep in mind their motivation for saving these babies was the high mortality rate of children in the ancient world. When 40% of your population is dying before the age of 12, every chance at life matters. Today, medical technology and vaccines can save almost every child that is born. Among industrialized nations, the infant mortality rate is often less than half of 1%. So the urgency to save every child is not nearly as pressing as it was in the ancient world. Indeed, today we are so good at saving children that the world population has exploded from 1.6 billion people in 1900 to almost 7.8 billion people in 2020. The question we are asking today is not, can we bear enough children to survive, but rather, are there too many people on the planet? When you're living in a world where survival rates are low, the Christian ethics surrounding childbirth makes a lot of sense. Sex leads to life, and there are a lot of barriers that prevent life from thriving. Therefore, humans need to have as much sex as possible to produce as much life as possible so that we can tilt the odds for survival in our favor. This is why the biblical authors believed it was morally wrong to abort or abandon human life. The authors of the Bible never imagined a world where almost every child born will make it into adulthood. This is a big reason why the Bible's laser focus on the preservation of a baby's life can feel so out of place in our modern world.
Evangelical Christians, they don't care about the social outcomes of the child. What they care about is the fact that the child is born and that is a child of God. But they don't really care about the social outgrowth of all this. They would never ask the question that many other Christians do ask, and that is, what about the social outcomes of a person having a child? For instance, Methodists across the country have asked this question constantly and said, it matters if we have a child, what about the social support for the child? So there are evangelical Christian denominations who do ask this question. Baptists do not now. They used to. They don't now. Episcopals do. Lutherans do. The Catholic Church is a mixed bag on this. At least you can say for the Catholic Church that even though they insist on no abortion, they try to figure out a way to care for the child. Protestant evangelicals tend not to care. And that turns again to that individualistic orientation. You should take care of yourself. Once you're standing before God, you should be responsible. That's free will of the individual, but no responsibility of society.
When almost every pregnancy is going to result in a healthy birth, it changes the moral equation significantly and allows you to pose moral questions that the Bible simply ignores. For instance, if a woman is pregnant, does she have the necessary resources to provide for her child? Can she feed the child, clothe the child, give the child a good chance at leading a successful life? Speaking of resources, given that there are a finite number of resources on the planet, is it ethical to have a child when it's becoming increasingly harder for the earth to produce enough calories to sustain human life? Which leads to the question, should a woman be able to choose when she gets pregnant? This is a subject where almost everyone has an opinion. So our reporter, Laura Savage, went out to the streets of Chicago and randomly asked people their thoughts about this issue.
At the end of the day, I think it's a woman's right.
No firm decision. I see both sides, and I have empathy for both sides. So I would have a hard time, saying anything until I was in that situation.
I guess if I have to choose, I am anti-abortion. Do your best not to go down that route, I guess. If you can help it.
The medical system should not have restrictions on women and restrictions on what women can do to their bodies or not, because ultimately women should be able to call the shots about what they need in their life.
But I think it's like anything else, it shouldn't be abused. So I think a lot of people aren't careful. So I guess I'm pro-abortion in certain cases. I don't think it should be used as like counter as opposed to Plan B pill or like condoms. And then also late-term abortion I'm against. Unless it's related to like maybe birth defects that would cause the child great pain and suffering.
If it's rape or something of that nature, I think it's acceptable. However, I don't think that it's right if it doesn't have to be.
For me personally, if I were in a situation where I had an unwanted pregnancy, I don't know if I would personally choose it. But I think that it's women's right to choose. Obviously when it gets further into the pregnancy, it becomes a little murkier, but I definitely in the first trimester, it's just some cells to me. And then I feel like if it's later in the pregnancy, it should come down to more for health issues for the women or for the unborn child.
Abortion is something that no one wants. No woman wants to lose their child, and I was adopted, so I understand that especially. But I do believe that it's a woman's choice to have an abortion, and some women will have abortions whether they're legal or not. So I think it's important that it's a service that's provided to women. It's not my decision. Here's a better strategy. Vasectomies are reversible. So maybe they should have all the men get vasectomies until they're mature enough and financially stable enough to have kids.
These comments highlight something very important about the modern abortion debate. In our world, abortion is utilized as a form of contraception. Abortion is a means of stopping a pregnancy. But this way of talking about abortion would have made no sense to the authors of the Bible. Given the high child mortality rates, why would you ever want to use contraception? They would be dumbfounded by the idea that you would want to prevent pregnancy. But in our world, where every successful birth means you've just inherited an 18-year responsibility, the choice to prevent pregnancy becomes critically important. This choice means that we now have to consider the circumstances surrounding the pregnancy. In other words, how did the woman become pregnant? Was she having sex with the intention of becoming pregnant? Was she having sex while utilizing birth control, believing that she would avoid pregnancy? Was the sex consensual, or was she being raped? When we associate pregnancy with choice, rather than being solely focused on the birth of the child, then all of these questions begin to matter, which brings us back to Felicia. Felicia was not given a choice, and the circumstances surrounding her pregnancy were horrific. If you remember, once she discovered she was pregnant, she was too far along to have an abortion. The reason why abortion is often recommended in cases of incest are many. The child is more likely to have serious genetic problems. The child is more likely to have severe cognitive impairment and a shorter lifespan. But most importantly, the mother may not have the emotional capacity to raise the child. The child is a constant reminder of the sexual trauma that produced that life. But Felicia chose to keep her child, so I asked her about her decision.
Early on, I knew that I was attracted to girls. And I don't know if it was because in my head that might have been my only chance to have any kids. Because, of course, you with a woman, you're going to have a kid. It's not possible. But I didn't look at the fact that it was how he was conceived at the time. I didn't focus on that. I knew it was wrong. But I just felt like he's a part of me. And I didn't want that part of me to just die away. Like I said, if I have to make that decision again, I will keep it. I wouldn't want the same situation, but I would keep it, regardless of if I knew that the child was born with any type of disabilities or formations or anything. To me, that decision is always up to the woman if she's able, mentally, physically, to take care of it.
And yet, many Christians are resistant to the notion that women should be placed in the position to choose whether or not to proceed with their pregnancy. Such a choice is seen as immoral and often equated with murder, even though, as we discussed, the scriptures make no such argument. And this brings us back to the issue of repression. As much as we repress difficult issues within our own lives, this also happens on a societal level within cultures. Again, Dr. Melissa Perrin.
Now, culturally, of course, culture is made up of all of us individuals choosing how to live together, making active, conscious choices to cooperate with each other or not, to be in relationship with each other or not. And in making those societal decisions of how to live with each other, the culture then begins to agree that there are certain things we simply cannot talk about. And so we rely on each other, we rely on the group to begin to bring the full narrative into play or the full image into play. And a group is actively shut down because it's too dangerous for the larger group to hear or see. Or one by one, the members of the group are silenced or agreements are made. Don't bring that up, don't talk about that, I'll make it worth your while. And then the group loses an opportunity to know something. For some people, the act of engaging in behaviors can be so frightening or so devastating. And if they are leaders, the leaders can use their own fear or their own life experience or their own desire for a community to live in such a way that they'll say, we cannot do this, this is not allowed.
What has happened in the Christian faith is that certain communities have become so narrowly focused on the moment of birth that they have repressed consideration of any negative elements that might impact the child's life before and after that moment. Particularly in evangelical circles, church leaders have made it taboo to discuss the social outcomes of unwanted pregnancies, which incentivizes the rest of the community to repress those questions as well. And the truth is, there's good reason why they don't want to talk about it. It's hard to control the social outcomes of a child. When parents lack emotional maturity or lack the resources to properly provide for their child, there's no quick fix for that. You're talking about years of investment with no guarantee of improvement. Whereas if we're talking about the moment of birth, that can be controlled. It can be legislated, and by equating abortion with murder, you can erase much of the gray area that can easily occlude the discussion. But is repressing all that information the right thing to do? Knowing the biblical history surrounding the issue of abortion and how the world we live in today is so vastly different from the ancient world, I believe it is immoral for Christians not to take into account the circumstances surrounding the inception of a child and the social outcomes of the child. In the same way that I argued in the first episode that we need to stop viewing sex as an act that has been sanctified by God, I'm making the argument that Christians need to stop viewing the inception of human life as an act sanctified by God. Once we shift the moral marker from a sperm fertilizing an egg to the circumstances surrounding that fertilization, then choice and consent become the primary drivers of our sexual morals. And that makes sense in the 21st century, where our goal is no longer to reproduce to survive, but to give every child that is born the best possible chance to have a positive and productive life. A big thank you to Felicia Bruce for her willingness to openly and honestly discuss the very raw topic of her sexual assault. Her son Ryan is an amazing testament to her strength and resilience. I also want to thank Dr. Melissa Perrin for talking about the effects of sexual repression. You're going to be hearing a lot more from Dr. Perrin throughout this season because her work and her insights are vital to forging a new path forward for the church. Once again, I want to extend my appreciation to Dr. Dixon Sutherland for talking about the history of abortion in the Bible. He's a remarkable scholar who continues to produce important work in the area of Christian environmental ethics. Restorative Faith is a collaboration between myself, Rebecca Anderson, and Laura Savage. The music in this episode was written by Iconics Music, DP Music, Michael Musco, Music Box, Roman Cano, Eaton Epstein, Goldie Shine, and Yoav Alagon. For more information on this and other episodes, please visit us at restorativefaith.org. What would your message be to people who have been through something like what you've been through?
You have to be the stronger person. You have to be able to overcome your fear and, like I said, be able to forgive. You'll never forget. You will absolutely never forget. To go through what I went through and be able to forgive my abuser, my rapist, and continue to look him in the eye and speak freely to him. You can't feel any prouder of yourself than I do when I do that.
Next time on Restorative Faith.
We had a housewarming party after we moved to a new apartment. He started drinking, and it was drinking too much, and he was holding the baby, and he dropped the baby. Michael was like 4 months old at that time. It was scary, and then he would go out and not come back until, like 3 a.m, and I wouldn't know where he was, and he wouldn't tell me, or he would tell me, but I wouldn't really believe him.
Humans globally have ridiculously large amounts of sexual activity compared to almost all other organisms.
I consider myself a Christian, and I still read the Bible, and the Bible tells me I shouldn't be living my life this way, but it feels too right. And a lot of the other couples I know are being adulterous within their marriage and hiding it, and we've figured out how to do it on the up and up and make it better for our relationship.